Tell us what you have accomplished as Commissioner of Agriculture and Consumer Services that has tangibly improved the lives of everyday people in Florida.
Well, first of all, again, thank you everybody for being here. And we only have an hour, Steve. We've done a lot. I was actually just getting off right beforehand of a round table with food nutrition professionals across the state of Florida that is going to kick off a series with the White House and talking about what we've been able to do in the food nutrition program. The fact of the matter is that we came in and we knew that there was about 3 million Floridians that were food insecure, and 850,000 of those are our kids. So we immediately put together a food nutrition task force of 16 individuals across our state, looking at ways to get rid of food insecurity, tackle some of the issues of food waste. And then even during the pandemic, when unfortunately our governor refused to bring down additional funds for whether it was the EBT, the SNAP EBT, to even dollars going down to our school programs when our schools were closed down. We were the ones who went across the entire state, had press conference after press conference, trying to encourage the governor to bring down that money. And we worked with the White House to bring down close to $93 million to offset what was happening in our school lunch programs, to make sure that our school boards could still, and our school districts could still feed our families. And the same thing on just making sure that money was coming down, the coordination during the pandemic. Really made sure that people were still being fed. When our schools closed on that March 13th, we made sure that not a single child was going to go hungry on that day on Monday. And that's just kind of one aspect of it. We've legalized hemp in our state, which has given out $380 million worth of economic incentives programs, 12,000 jobs, 25,000 acres under grow. And of course, one of the most significant aspects of what we've been able to do is we kicked the NRA out of my office and made sure that everybody had a complete and thorough background check inside the Department of Licensing. And those save lives and fundamentally change people's opportunities to protect themselves and make sure that people were safe. The other things that we've done that really is going to transform people's lives is our water quality. We came in and we gutted our agriculture water policy department, started to go through our BMP program, updating our manuals, making sure that agriculture was going to play an important role in that balancing act between agriculture and our environment. Like I said, Steve, I can go on for hours on exactly what we've accomplished, but it's a tremendous amount that we've done for the people of our state.
Okay, I do want to ask a follow-up question about one aspect of something you touched on, and that is the concealed weapons licensing program, which people may or may not be aware. I realize we have more than 2 million Floridians now have concealed weapons permits, and some people find it odd that it has long been under the control of the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. At one point, am I correct, you took credit for streamlining the process of getting a concealed weapons permit? I ask that because I think a lot of Democratic voters would like to see it be as difficult as possible to get a gun. So what is your position on that?
Look, I think that is a misconception too, from what Democrats want gun safety. They want to make sure that there's universal background checks. They want to make sure that the individuals who have a right to have a gun are going through that background. They want to make sure that people who should not have a gun don't get one. So what we did is we came in and we streamlined the process, streamlined it, but made it efficient. So everybody had a complete and thorough background check. We made sure that we were getting through the backlog, because if some of you remember that, in Adam's situation, for 13 months, background checks weren't done, and 292 individuals fell through the cracks. And some of those cases were getting on the verge of the 90 days, which at 90 days, you automatically have to grant somebody if you haven't heard back from the Department of Agriculture. So we came in and we streamlined, but in an efficient manner, that everybody received a complete and thorough background check, making sure that it was done in an effective and efficient manner. And that's my job. My job is to follow the laws and to make sure the government is working properly. And I have touted that, and I've spoken to a lot of gun prevention activists, and they are so proud of the record that we've been able to do in the licensing department.
Let me ask you today, if you know, today, right now, start to finish, if somebody applies for a concealed weapons permit today, July 13th, how long will it take to get the permit?
If there is no issues, meaning that just from the processing and they look through the background check, it's probably within 2 weeks. where the average at that point when I first took over was close to 80 days. If there is an issue, then it's just a matter of how much interaction that the applicant has with our office to be able to get through the issues, to either give us the paperwork, to respond to us. So that's kind of on a range. We try to immediately rectify the situation if there's a background problem or they were needing documents from out of state to be able to notify them. So what I am hearing is that the average, if there's a problem with the background check or there's a problem with the application, it's roughly about 28, 30 days. But that again depends on the applicant's ability to communicate with us and get the requisite paperwork to us.
I have one more question, and then I'll open the floor for questions to any and all of my colleagues. But we'll stay on the subject of firearms for just a moment. My question, Nikki, concerns an organization called Ban Assault Weapons Now, BAWN, which is has an online petition drive and has asked elected officials and candidates to sign a pledge promising to support an assault weapons ban. It is the position of Gail Schwartz, the director of that organization, that you refused to sign their pledge for a period of more than 6 months. You did sign it, but she's still concerned that it took you so long to sign it. So what happened there?
This is very easy. Look at my actions, look at my words, look at what I've been able to do when it comes to gun safety. There should be nobody in the entire country or in the state of Florida who ever should question where I am on gun safety. Not only from what I've done inside the Department of Agriculture, the bills that I have stood next to our legislators to support, whether it is ammunition background checks, to ghost guns, to safety, finding loopholes in my own department. But I have a fundamental issue of signing pledges. That's the issue that across the board, because I don't think that a pledge holds anybody accountable. And if you read the verbiage even of this pledge in particular, it talks more about legislative action. I'm not running for a legislative position. I'm not running for a legislature. I'm not running for Congress. And I let them know that. And you also saw many of my comments on social media saying that I would sign an assault weapons ban. And until my friend David Hogg called me and said, Nikki, I understand your positioning. I understand that there's been some issues with this organization in particular, but this is important to me. And David and I have become close friends in the last 4 years, and something that was really important to him. So we signed it. But my words, my actions speak much louder than a petition that, quite honestly, doesn't hold a lot of water at the end of the day. My words do, and what I've done in the past for safety.
Just a quick follow-up. If, as you say, it applies more to legislative candidates and it's mostly symbolic, why sign it at all?
Again, it came down to when David called me and said, and we had a very frank conversation. I talked to David on a pretty normal basis. And when David said, I get it, and we talked through, and I had some other issues with the actual organization itself, with the consultants that had been running the organization, the fact that they had spent a lot of money to not get it onto the ballot, that consult. And so I talked through some of the organizational aspects of the group. And when David said, I get all that stuff, I have the same concerns, this is really personal to me, and this is really important to me. I said, David, I am in the trenches with you. If this is important to you to help with this cause, I will sign it for you. But
Okay.
my words, are a lot stronger than that.
All right, thank you. I'm going to open the floor to my colleagues for questions. So,
All right.
Well, a basic question. We know that you and Congressman Chris can pick at each other's past records. But as of the moment, what do you disagree about looking forward?
What do I disagree about with Charlie? Where do I start? The fact of the matter is that he doesn't take accountability for any of his past actions. As of today, he said 2 weeks ago that, he doesn't regret appointing, Justice Kennedy. That is going to be a Supreme Court justice right now, Chief Justice, who refused to hear the case on the discriminatory congressional maps, is going to be leading the charge to overturn our right to privacy. And Charlie today says, I don't regret that decision. That is a major problem. The other issue that I talk about all the time too on a difference in policies, Charlie came late to the game about legalization of cannabis, and he wants to take that money and he wants to put it towards more law enforcement funding. That's not where the money needs to go. The money needs to go into the communities that have been the most harmed by the war on drugs. And that is in our Black and brown communities. And I look at that from, as a past public defender, I saw firsthand those communities that were targeted. And so when we legalize cannabis, which will happen, that's where the money needs to go. It needs to go back into those communities who've been disenfranchised, who've been jailed for these issues. And still to this day, yeah, Charlie's record is a big concern. And most importantly, he's not willing to say, I'm sorry. He's not willing to say, I made a mistake, or he's not willing to say, even I've evolved. He gets very, very loose on his wording, trying to pull the wool over everybody's eyes. So, that's kind of been my biggest critique of Charlie. And the fact of the matter is he has no plan of how he's going to win in November. You ask him and he says, I'm just going to get votes. That's not a plan, Charlie.
As a follow-up to that, you have frequently criticized the governor, or former Governor Cross, for that, the Republican background, conservative positions in the past, and yet you have also had close ties with many of the elected Republicans right now. Contributed to Ashley Moody's campaign, to Joe Biden. And I'm wondering, when people ask you about those connections, how do you square that off with your criticism of Crist for his association with his own past?
Look, there's a huge difference. It's comparing apples and oranges. Charlie was a Republican for most of his career. The things that he did has severely hurt the people of our state. Whether it was, gutting the Affordable Trust Fund, which is hurting people today, the trickle down impact, the fact that he signed the piece of legislation that got rid of the 5-year inspections of the condos, to his positioning on abortion, to his anti-LGBTQ on gay marriage and gay adoption, the fact that the things that he has done, he's not willing to hold himself accountable. And the fact of the matter is that he was an institution of the Republican Party. He was holding chains in the middle of the Senate chambers, talking about chains, gangs, and his, what he did as, when he was a senator, pushing forth some of this criminal justice bills that people still today are in jail and in prison because of laws that he worked on. When I say very clearly, there is a night and day. Look at my actions, my entire life. From doing soup kitchens to Habitat for Humanity when I was in high school, and soup kitchens, to my past as a public defender. So when Charlie is passing these types of laws, I'm out there on the streets defending people. Out there, when I was during the foreclosure crisis, coming down to South Florida, fighting for our homeowners and taking on the big banks. My record is impeccable when it comes to the issues that I'm fighting for today. And look, at the end of the day, we also know that we have a purple state. And it's okay to have friends on both sides of the aisle that you're willing to work with. But look at my actions. Look what I've been fighting for. Look at what I have been doing. And Democrats, more than anything else right now, they want one thing. They want to beat Ron DeSantis. And they know that in order to do that, they need somebody who is going to be a proven winner, which Charlie is not as a Democrat. And they need somebody who knows how to fight for what we believe in. And that is not Charlie. So when we go back through our comparison of our records, and the things that who I supported is a time when I represented the Broward School Board. Of course, I had to become friends with the individuals who were making decisions on education. That was my job. Does it mean that I supported everything about them? Of course not. Charlie, on the other hand, everything he has done as a Republican has hurt people today. And why Democrats has Marco Rubio and Rick Scott today, or because of selfish decisions that Charlie made during his political career. And the comparison is just night and day.
Well, if I could follow up there real quickly, when you say everything that Charlie did as a Republican, hurt people. I think it's pretty easy to think of one major thing that he did that changed a lot of people's lives, and that was opening up the question of restoring civil rights to people who had felony convictions. So
Yeah,
that
but also, let's also put that into perspective too. He didn't do it alone. He had to convince that's the clemency board. He thinks that it wasn't an executive action that he took. He had an entire clemency board that also had to buy into this. So this wasn't a solo action of his. And just because every once in a while that Charlie did something humane, doesn't mean that his past record on everything else doesn't need to be brought up and he needs to be held accountable for.
I know that Ron DeSantis has really changed the game in terms of the powers of the governor's office and the reach of the governor's office. And over time, those powers have expanded and contracted back and forth. I want to know what you would do, and really regardless of party, what the next governor should do in terms of changing those powers. What would you do to affect the powers of the governor's office?
You know, it's a balancing act. And I don't think in the checks and balances. And on top of that, I think that one of my biggest criticisms on the governor is the fact that he's trying to pull all this power into the governor's office, whether it's taking power away from the cabinet, basically taking power away from the legislature. Look what he did during the pandemic. He allocated funds that should have gone through, through the legislature, to even, putting up his nose to the Supreme Court. Time and time again, taking away power from the legislature when it comes to the congressional maps. And so I know that in our Constitution, it talks about the fact that the cabinet is supposed to govern together. And, I actually had a funny conversation with our Senate president during not this past legislative session, the previous legislative session, where they were, at that time, the governor was trying to take away the voting, dealing with DEP, dealing with Veterans Affairs, Highway and Motor Vehicles, and FDLE. And I went in to Wilton and I said, look, this is taking away power from the cabinet. And Wilton said, well, aren't you running for governor? Isn't that something that you would want if you were in? And I said, no, because I believe in democracy. I believe in that checks and balances. And unfortunately, you have seen a governor who has spent most of the last 3.5 years trying to find ways to make himself more powerful by not having cabinet meetings, by going around the cabinet, by again, trying to even take power away from the legislature and the courts. So as governor, that is part of my job to restore that checks and balances. Because I know that depending, every 4 to 8 years, we're changing governors. And that's why you have to have that checks and balances in place to make sure our democracy works and to live up to the true ideals of 3 branches. Well, actually, I'll count you all as the 4th branch. And certainly making sure that the cabinet is in a position to truly have a seat at the table.
I had a couple of questions that I hoped are pretty simple yes, no position ones. One has to do with net metering. Net metering was a bill that Florida Power and Light pushed that would cut credits received by solar customers. Governor DeSantis vetoed that bill, but there's good reason to think it will come back once again at FPL's urging. I think you'd said you'd oppose net metering bill, but I was wondering if you were also willing to say that if you are elected and the bill comes back, is that a bill you're ready to veto as well?
Yes.
Okay, great. Nice and simple. The next one I wanted to ask about is immigration and mandatory E-Verify. Florida Republicans have talked a lot about cracking down on undocumented immigration, but they always seem to stop short of cracking down on the employers who employ, and I would argue in some cases, exploit undocumented immigrants. As you may know, as agriculture commissioner, the ag industry flat out says that more than half of their workers are undocumented. So I was wondering where you stand on the idea of mandatory E-Verify for all private employers without exceptions.
I actually, when we've had now 2 rounds of this piece of legislation that come through with the sanctuary cities, and they came back, I think it was a year after that, and expanded it. And both times I have been very vocal against. Because look, I'm Commissioner of Agriculture, as you point out, Scott, and there are 2 million individuals that work inside of agriculture. 1 million of those are undocumented. And so that's why I've been very vocal at the national level, have testified in front of Congress, have been on a lot of panels talking about the necessity for comprehensive immigration reform. And I've had an opportunity to talk to so many of these communities in the migrant community workforce, whether it's Opaka or Immokalee or even down in Southwest Florida, hearing their stories, hearing that every family has a contingency plan if their family member doesn't come home that day. That is gut wrenching. That is gut wrenching to hear what these families are going through. I've even made a promise that I'm going to make sure that as governor, one of the things that we do is that we have ID cards that are ready for anybody who lives here, because there is, and even I see it during the pandemic. During the pandemic, when Ron refused to put vaccine locations in some of these communities, I had to go around Ron, put them in the facilities, and then they're starting to ask for IDs. I had to personally call and say, I'm sorry, these are human beings. They live and work in our state. If they want a vaccine, they got to get a vaccine. And so I think that on the federal level is where immigration reform needs to happen. But the realization that you've got people here in the state of Florida that are living here, that are working here, that are part of our economy, we got to take care of it on the federal level. But certainly, as my job as governor is to make sure that our state is safe, and to make sure that people that are living here with dignity and security, that they're not going to be hauled away from their family, and that they are going to be having an opportunity to eventually get to, again, the national immigration reform, to eventually get to whether it's visas or potential, legal potential of getting immigration reform, that they can get their citizenship.
Okay. I also wanted to go back to what we were talking about a little bit about sort of cross-party issues. Obviously, right now we're talking about a Democratic primary, and among Democrats, I think it's safe to say that Matt Gaetz is not a popular figure. Yet a good deal has been written, and in fact, Matt Gaetz has talked about how close the two of you are, both personally and on some policy issues. So I'm wondering, what do you think Democratic primary voters should make of your connections to a guy who I think many of them would have questions about?
Well, first of all, don't believe anything that Matt says. I think that he has been proven to not be trustworthy on things that come out of his mouth. But I've also been very frank. We all know each other. I mean, you all know how Tallahassee works. Everybody knows each other. I was active on the cannabis reform issues. And so we were able to work together on those issues. Outside of that, I've had to go up to DC and lobby him on the disaster relief package back in 2019. When I've gone up to DC to testify on other related issues, he's part of the congressional delegation. Outside of that, there's nothing there. If he is actually, any of these allegations he's charged, these allegations are atrocious. And certainly, as a past, public defender and somebody who's involved in wanting to make sure that the law is followed, if he broke a law, then he absolutely has to be held accountable. And outside of that, there's nothing there. And there's a lot of just narrative about this. And truthfully, I wouldn't take Matt for anything he says.
Okay. And the last question I wanted to ask you also has to deal with medical marijuana, which you just mentioned. Last year, one of our reporters, Jason Garcia, dug in a lot into your background in the industry. And two of the things that caught my attention most was that you were personally had invested in one of the state's few licensed marijuana providers at one point, and that your fiance was one of only, I think, 17 hemp extractors in Florida that was permitted by your department. And I guess the question I would have is, why shouldn't citizens be concerned about those conflicts?
First of all, there's no conflicts. I made it very clear to the people of our state in 2018 that I came from the industry. That is what got me to my activism, my desire to not only expand the medical marijuana program, but also get to legalization. And I've also said very frankly on the record that we need more licenses. We need to break up vertical integration. That actually would go against so basically what had happened was when I worked for one of the companies, part of my compensation was shares. And so that there's nothing more there. And so at that point, breaking up vertical integration, expanding out more licenses actually diminishes my financials. And we are certainly in the middle of actually, selling. Jake and I are no longer together. And even still, when it comes to the hemp industry, we put up a tremendously large firewall inside the office. And we have made sure, because not even just the medical marijuana side, I knew a significant amount of people across the state and across the country that are involved in hemp. So we made sure that we created a firewall. I have no involvement indirectly or directly with any of the permits, from growing to manufacturing to the retail side, outside of what's on the website. So there is absolutely no conflict of interest whatsoever when it comes to anything in the hemp industry, and even in the cannabis industry.
And I think you just said something we didn't know, or I didn't know. Did you say you're in the process of divesting yourself? Right now, you still are invested in one of the state's few licensed marijuana providers, right?
Yes, it's on my financials. So I still have
Okay.
like a few thousand shares of Trulieve when Trulieve bought Harvest.
Okay.
Was originally San Velasco Nursery, but we are in the process. I am in the process of liquidating those assets anyhow.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
I'm going to jump in here very briefly if I can, because thanks for those questions very much, Scott. An immigration question, Commissioner Fried. Would you be in favor of issuing either state ID cards or Florida driver licenses to undocumented immigrants, and why?
Yes, Stephen, I said that with Scott's answer. I said yes, I would, because the fact that whether it is driver's license or IDs, it is important to make sure that those individuals feel that they're safe here in the state of Florida, that they can work. And so especially even on driving, that they are driving on our roads. They are driving out here, and to make sure that they have access to, that they're going through the prerequisites to get a driver's license, to make sure that they can get insurance. And so that you have individuals that are driving through our states, working here. And we're not sending 1 million plus people home. That's not happening. Or the 17 million, I think, is the number across the country. That's not realistic. So we need to make sure that we have comprehensive immigration reform at the federal level, but we got to do what we need to do on the state level to make sure that those that are working here, living here, have protections.
Okay. All right. And I've got a question on a completely different topic that's much more political, but it's relevant. And there are journalists on this call who've been covering Florida for decades. Some of us here go back to when Bob Graham was governor. And here's the question: who and what are the chief reasons, in your judgment, as to why we have seen this long, slow descent by the Democratic Party in the state of Florida?
Oh, that is a very long answer, but I will do it my best. First off, we used to have the Dixiecrats. We used to have Southern Democrats, Blue Dog Democrats. And when the shift of the party happened around Bob Graham and Lawton Chiles, Democrats didn't do enough to expand the base, didn't do enough to see what was happening when it came to our rural communities, that we were losing these Blue Dog Democrats to Republicans, and now their children and grandchildren are Republicans. And so we didn't do enough to expand. But more importantly than that, and I talk a lot about this on the campaign trail, and the huge difference between myself and Charlie is that I have a plan of how to fix this. That two issues are happening. Number one, we are spending so much of our resources at the top of the ticket, whether it's U.S. Senate seat, whether it is the governor's race, and the money stays there. And we know that our House seats, our Senate seats, our city and county commission seats don't have the resources to truly compete. And so we need to be sending the money south to make sure that those local candidates have the resources they need to be doing the door knocking, to be going out there, to make sure that they've got the resources, because when they're doing the persuasive talking on the ground, that lifts up the top of the ticket. I can't tell you how many times in 2018 I kept being told, don't worry, Nikki, if the top of the ticket wins, so do you. And that is a false narrative inside the Democratic Party, and that we haven't done enough to really energize and to give the resources necessary on the bottom of the ticket. The other issue is that we have been focusing so much on just turning out the blue and making sure that we're hitting those blue counties and not going into the areas that we need to lose by less. In 2018, we focused on 13 counties outside of the blue areas to make sure that we are flipping Seminole, to make sure that we are flipping Duval, that we lost by less in some of those other communities. My first TV commercials were in Fort Myers and Lee County, because we knew we had to lose by less in some of those areas. And that makes a tremendous amount of difference to show up to some of those areas. And not only has Democrats done that wrong, but since Barack Obama, we've been doing it wrong. That even when Hillary came here and Joe, they spent more time just in the blue areas and not going to the other parts of our state. That is never a winning equation since Lawton Chiles, when the state was fundamentally different and the demographics were different. And that's been a losing formulation for Democrats. And that is the thing that I will be focusing on.
Okay, I have just a quick follow-up question on that. It's related. A very clear pattern has emerged, and we've all written about it. In a statewide election, a Democrat can be counted upon to win about 9 or 10 counties. And we all know which counties those are. Certainly Broward and Palm Beach are on that list, and Orange and Osceola are on that list in Central Florida for sure. And as you said a minute ago, Democrats didn't do enough to expand the base. Can you give us an example of a county where you, Nikki Fried, are going to beat the odds and do better than other Democrats have done in past elections?
Sure. Just look at 2018. I mean, I outperformed the top of the ticket in Dade County. I outperformed the top of the ticket in Seminole County, and the same thing in Duval. I have been out in the Panhandle a significant amount of time since not only when I was running, but also as commissioner. After Hurricane Michael, I spent a lot of time in Mexico Beach, spent a lot of time trying to rebuild the Panhandle, going out there for fires, being responsive. I've spent a significant amount of time in not only Duval now, but also in Sarasota. And over this weekend, I actually went to Lake City in Columbia County. With the first time they said to me in a roundtable, it's the first time they have seen a statewide Democrat in Columbia County. So we are going to go everywhere. And I think here's another big issue of why it has to be Mia as our candidate. I'm Commissioner of Agriculture. I have spent a lot of time, and it's unfortunate that we had the pandemic and I couldn't continue doing this during the pandemic, but we have spent a lot of time going into those rural communities, going and making sure that we gave them resources, that we're talking about the issues, whether it was broadband or whether it was economic opportunities, to just protecting agriculture. Even the immediate, people in Volusia County that are in agriculture. We have done a lot to stand up agriculture in the last 3.5 years, so much to the point that so many people inside of agriculture and leaders have said, this is what a Commission of Agriculture is supposed to be doing. The amount of times that I've gone up to Washington, D.C. to testify and to encourage individuals to help, sorry, my phone was just ringing, going through, I'm going to decline that, to make sure that we were protecting agriculture. And so we have gained a lot of credibility inside of our rural community, inside of agriculture, which you're going to see that Ron has not done. Ron has basically ignored agriculture on so many different fronts, whether it was first, even when he was a member of Congress. I heard from past leaders in Farm Bureau and other agriculture industries that have gone up to DC to lobby Ron. He refused to have meetings with them. Then he ran against Adam, and now I'm commissioner. And so he has really neglected a lot of agriculture. They know that. These are hardworking Floridians that the partisan label is less important to them. They care about somebody showing up and fighting for them. And that's why we're going to do better in those areas.
Hi, Nikki. I wanted to follow up on something he said. When Steve mentioned the long, slow slide of Democrats, the first thing you brought up was the Dixiecrats. And you think of like the Panhandle, that sort of thing. And those people who were conservative Democrats, they are now conservative Republicans. They're not coming back.
Yep.
What's been a problem in the last couple of cycles is places like Dade, the Hispanic vote. That to me seems a more immediately urgent problem for the Democratic Party. So what is your plan to reach out to people of color, but in the Hispanic community, in the Black community, to make sure that they not only turn out, but turn out for Democrats? Because if what happened in the last couple of cycles continues,
Yep.
Democrats are going to lose this election.
Without a doubt. And here's what we've been doing. First of all, I go back to what happened in 2020. And I've been very critical publicly and behind closed doors of what did not happen in 2020, that the Biden campaign wasn't here. They weren't, going after those votes. They didn't go into the Hispanic community and say, Socialisa, what? And fight back and try to figure out what was going on the ground. They conceded all of these issues. You might have had one or two candidates here and there, but when I called the head of the Biden campaign in 2020, and I said, we've got a problem in Miami-Dade. And she was like, no, we're fine. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm from Miami. When I drive around the Gables and the Grove, and I'm seeing Trump banners, communities that have never been engaged on a national level like that, maybe local politics. And she's like, oh, don't worry, we're still polling close to Hillary's numbers. We're going to be just fine. And I said, no, you're not. She said, well, we're going to have a concert. We're going to bring J-Lo. And I'm like, we're going to bring J-Lo? How is that going to change the hearts and the minds of the Hispanic community? So I saw that, I heard it, I vocalized it, and they didn't listen. And so since launching the campaign, we have been very active. We not only started a Nikki Escucha, Nikki Listens Tour, where we have spent a lot of time dissecting each part of the community, whether it's the Cuban population, to Puerto Rican, to Venezuelan, to Colombian, had roundtables with each of these communities to do a lot of listening of what their issues are on the ground, created the first ever Latin American Advisory Council that I meet with on a consistent basis, have been down the trenches. I was actually marched a year ago on July 11th down in Hialeah. The mayor of Hialeah invited me to come march and to be with them. I'm looking back here, my Cubanos con Biden, our friends of Fried. I don't know if you can see my dominoes, that we have been there, including this past week. You know, we went down to the Cuban Museum of the Cuban Diaspora down in Miami to help celebrate and to recognize, you know, what happened a year ago. And so we are showing up. And we are going down there. We're having those hard conversations. We're listening, most importantly. And as I worked the room at this event on Monday night, no one was Democrats in there. No other Democrats showed up. There weren't even Republicans there. And I went around and I introduced myself and I said, I'm just here to show support. I'm here to listen. I'm here to fight for democracy here in Florida and for the United States, and to make sure that those who are coming here to our country, and some of them are coming as exiles, and that have no resources, have no family, have no friends here, to make sure that we're doing everything possible to ingratiate them into the state and make sure they've got the resources. And the same thing, the Black community. I have spent a lot of time, not just running for office and not just being in office, but just who I am as a person, and talking to the Black community. Because one thing that the Black community needs to hear, we've been voting. We've been voting for Democrats. What are we getting for it? There's been no return on our vote. And I have that very frank conversation with the Black community and say, I get it. I hear you. I understand. It's time to stop talking about, you know, just criminal justice reform and gun violence in our Black communities. Let's talk about the heart of what the issue is. And that is making sure that we are investing in those communities, that we are supporting our entrepreneurs, that we're supporting our small business owners, that we are actually putting resources in to give them economic opportunities, to make sure that they are starting to see generational wealth. I was in church this past weekend, and the pastor went on his whole entire sermon was based on the predatory lenders in our state, and the payday lenders, and how they are positioned directly in the Black communities and take advantage of them. And he looked directly at me. He says, we've got elected officials and future elected officials in the congregation today. I hope you are hearing us. And so that is how we're going to move the needle in the Black community, is by listening to them and actually have a plan, not just placating them with, we want more Black people in positions. Yes, that is important, but making sure that we are actually investing in those communities is even more essential.
Want to switch topics and talk about abortion and reproductive rights for women. So, you know, if you were elected in November, you're still likely going to have a Republican legislature. What would you do specifically to protect and or expand women's rights?
You know, first off, we need an executive order, you know, focusing on reproductive health care for women. And that happens on day one. That gives me the authorization and the power to hold back resources to potential state attorneys and prosecutors who may be going after doctors or patients, utilizing resources that if somebody needs to get a safe abortion outside of the state of Florida, and we don't have the movement yet, that we're providing those types of resources, those access, and then looking at what other powers that I may have. The second thing is utilizing the full weight of the governor's office to work on a constitutional amendment. I have no doubt in my mind that when the 15-week abortion ban gets to the Florida Supreme Court, they're going to overturn their precedents. We've seen that. We know that that's going to be coming. And so making sure that we've got a very clear new constitutional amendment that protects a woman's right to choose is the second thing. And utilizing the resources that I'm going to have outside of, you know, my bully pulpit to bring resources here to get signatures signed and get that onto the ballot, and then support it to make sure that it gets voted in. And third is, look, when you cut off the head of a snake, the rest of the snake dies. And when you cut off Ron DeSantis from this Republican legislature, as you have heard, I know a lot of them, some of them for 20 plus years. They are not radical like this. And I've had those. That's what I even testified at when I went to the Senate chambers and I testified on this issue. I said, you guys are doing this because of your party leadership, because of a governor who's pushing this narrative. I know that this is not what you all want to be doing, including Kathleen Pasadomo. On the floor, she tried, even as the incoming Senate president, she tried to have legislation amendments to make sure that there was an exemption for rape and incest. When we start also showing empirical data, because now to then, you're going to start hearing those stories of women that have had to cross over to other states, or have had to travel, or women that are potentially have had botched abortions. That is going to happen in the next 6 months, unfortunately. And being able to take that empirical data to the legislature and said, look, your actions had repercussions. So much so that your entire legislative agenda did not work because I'm here. That if your legislative agenda was popular, you'd have Governor DeSantis here. It wasn't. So unless you want to continue losing future elections, work with me to expand these again and go back to the 24-week. There was no problems with the 24-week. It has been on the books for a very long time. And we need to go back to that issue and go back to that 24-week and making sure that we're protecting rights. And so I will do whatever power I have, but those are kind of the steps approach that I'm looking at.
Just a brief follow-up here on this point. You would, after issuing the executive order, you would withhold state funds from state attorneys who are doing what? Prosecuting people?
Prosecuting. That if in fact that you are prosecuting a mother, a daughter, any woman who has potentially gotten an abortion, or most importantly, the doctors who are performing outside the 15 weeks, or for an exception for the rape and incest, or if you're seeing even a doctor who didn't get that second doctor that you needed for if it's the woman's life is at jeopardy, to make sure that prosecutions don't happen.
I know that we all watched with horror this summer, and months before that, as Florida had a epic die-off of manatees. A couple summers before that, we watched the parts of the intercoastal basically turn into what is frequently described as guacamole. There is a serious problem in many of Florida's water bodies. As Commissioner of Agriculture, you actually regulate some of the things that have been identified as some of the biggest problems, one of them being fertilizer. What have you done? And as governor, what would you do to stop the amount of fertilizer that is washing into our water bodies and causing these really terrible problems?
Yeah, this is a multi-pronged, obviously problem. And I spent a lot of time trying to focus on, because you remember my campaign from 2018, one of my 3 W's was water. And so we came in and utilized, whatever resources and power that I had. And some of those, people have to understand too, when it comes to even some of those, fertilizers and pesticides, I don't have a lot of authority at the end of the day. That if in fact the USDA has approved some of these, materials, as long as they've done checks, and are kind of check the box form, we don't have a lot of power to say no. However, if you remember, Aldicarb we found a glitch in their application process, and we were able to deny Aldicarb, which would have been another one of those chemicals that would have been disastrous for our state. So we were able to deny that application because they didn't meet all of the criterias. And so we used whatever power and authority. But also what we did was we recognized that the BMP program, the best management protocols, is one of those ways that the legislature has given the Department of Agriculture kind of an ability to use technology and innovation to do that balancing act. And a lot of those manuals had not been updated in 20 years. With all the new research that was out there, with all the new technology, with all the things that were coming out of IFAS, and they had not been integrated. And if you know how the program works, we inside the department, we create the manuals in conjunction with science, and then we send them over to DEP to actually sign off on the program, and then it comes back to us to help enroll. And then when somebody is not enrolled, it's not following once they've been enrolled, then you send them over to DEP for enforcement. So they've kind of weirdly bifurcated this plan. And what's happened is, unfortunately, when we tried to do a lot of these updates, DEP sat on the manuals to prolong it for as long as possible, and kept coming back with nuances of nonsense in order to not give me wins on the situation. But when they finally were able to send back some of the manuals and we were enrolling, we, for the first time ever, started to send cases over to DEP for enforcement. And unfortunately, we sent about 7,000. Prior to me being in office, we had zero had ever been sent over to DEP. And so since then, we have tried to follow up with DEP. What are you doing with those 7,000 cases? And the answers are not what I would like to hear. And so that's one of the other reasons why I, want to be governor, is because I'm seeing this bifurcation, and my hands are tied on so many of these different things moving forward when it comes to enforcement action from DEP, that they're not following through on that. The other thing when it comes to talking about phosphate, talking about fertilizer, look what happened at Piney Point. The fact that we've got these 27 gyp stacks all across the state of Florida that are all ticking time bombs. And I have been very vocal about how these are ticking time bombs, and that we've got to figure out, one, to not be expanding any more permits. We need to make sure that we are looking at, why are we doing it this way? What else can we do better? Can we do better on cleaning up the water, making sure that we're not dumping bad water back into poor communities? I have no regulation oversight over any of the phosphate mining in our state. That's all Department of DEP. And so while I have been a vocal opponent to any of this, including in DeSoto, where they're trying to expand out, Mosaic is trying to expand out one of their licenses and permits, again, at the same time, we're seeing leaks happening. As governor, I would be able to help fix this. And I've spent a lot of time even talking about the manatees. I've been out at some of the areas and some of the research centers that have pulled in the baby manatees, getting some information, seeing what we can do to help, and cleaning up our waterways. This is something that I have used whatever resources and power I've had inside the Department of Agriculture. But then, going over to the governor's office, obviously have more power, more resources. I've asked the governor to do a state of emergency when it comes to the manatees. He's refused to do that too, and trying to put more resources towards, saving our manatees. This is something that's a very big priority inside of Department of Agriculture, but as governor.
Well, I wanted to follow up really quickly.
Yes.
One of the other things with your department you point out is that you do have consumer services, and many of the areas, such as landlord-tenant law, which is one area where you oversee, are there? I've looked and I can't really identify any new programs that you might have created to help Floridians in this historic rental crisis. What have you done, and what more needs to be done?
A lot needs to be done. We have no authority to create any type of programs. Our stuff is the authority that we have when it comes to landlord tenants. It is the mitigation. That if there's a problem with a landlord tenant, we come in. We have no power to force a landlord to do right. If we find that there's actually something legally going wrong, we have to then send it over to the Attorney General to actually engage in any type of really enforcement action. So we come in and we work on mitigation, and we do that all the time. And we're seeing a significant amount of that. And what is the troublesome is that the governor's office has received hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government in order to help with rental assistance. And unfortunately, from my last calculations meeting with, we were with HUD, Secretary Fudge, I guess 2 weeks ago, and she brought up how much money is still sitting in the governor's office today that should be dispersed to our local governments. They should be elevating these programs, giving more PSAs about that there are resources that are available to them. And one of the things that day one of a Governor Fried administration, I'm declaring a state of emergency on housing, because that's what it is. It is an emergency of what's happening here, that we're seeing some areas 60% rent increases. That is not inflation. That is greed. And being able to utilize the Attorney General and the state attorneys to start going after these predatory landlords, because that's exactly what it is. And then allowing our local governments to do what they need to do to help with the rent, to make sure that there's programs, that the money is going out to help during these times. Because if you can't pay your rent, where are you living? We're going to be losing a lot of people in the state of Florida because they can't afford to live here. And so being able to disperse that money and disperse the money out to the local governments and going after these predatory landlords is something that has to happen on day one of a Fried administration.
2 years ago, after some serious injuries at Orlando theme parks, the Sentinel wrote about how theme parks aren't required to divulge many details about the injuries that happen there. Your office regulates rides. At that time, I think you and your office told us that better regulation or more disclosure was up to legislators. Well, flash forward 2 years later to this year when 14-year-old fell to his death. And we once again asked questions, and legislators said they were waiting on your department to make recommendations on that. I think some residents are justifiably skeptical about what looks like finger pointing here. And I guess the bottom line question is, do you believe the Disneys and Universals of the world should have to disclose more details and more timely details about accidents and injuries that happen on their property?
Yes. In fact, Scott, when that was all coming up, I think it was 2019, when I think it was first being reported about some of these issues. And I said to my team, go back in and figure out what we can do. What can we do? Because there is a significant carve out for the big five inside of my regulations. I've got virtually no oversight on them when it comes to this. The only thing that I am allowed to get right now, and they have to agree to it. So when we're in negotiations with like the Disneys of reporting documents and the OMUs of what we have to do, they have to agree with it. I can't even force any of these regulations over Disney. And so we went in and we tried to figure out what power we had and what expansion. And in fact, we tried passing legislation, and we did pass some of the legislation to kind of help on some of our oversight, but it's still carve outs for these. And so what we have done, and certainly when it comes to what happened in the tragedy that happened at Icon Park, we came in swiftly. And went through the regulations and the oversight that we do have to make sure that we were asking all the right questions, that we were going through the manuals, because basically the way that the program works is that we receive the manuals from the operators and from the manufacturers, and it is all we've got authority on, to the most part, is to go and make sure that we inspect that they have followed through with how the manual is done. And so when we first come out to the ride and we're doing our initial investigation, we were going through their manual. And then as kind of time has gone on, we said, okay, well, what else can we do to prevent things like this from happening? What other issues can need to be addressed in order to prevent something like this from ever happening again? And so what I've said to Geraldine and as well as Senator Bracey is that we're going to work together and looking through, again, this is outside of the big theme parks because I don't have oversight on some of those aspects, to make sure that we are proposing changes. It may not have saved necessarily this young boy's life, but making sure that we are looking to find those loopholes or finding those, I don't want to say inconsistencies, but those areas where we can beef it up. And so I've already been talking to my team to start going through that and looking and working with our legislators to propose that legislation to give me that authority to do more.
And I appreciate that. Just the original answer, which I think you said, though, as governor, when you would have that authority, you are in favor of more forced disclosure from those big five theme parks.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
But also I want to also go through, yes, I do. But here's where the little trick aspects is right now they have no obligation to send us anything. It's that initial report. And then it's trying to find, now you've got HIPAA issues, that whether or not the individual who's been harmed is going to tell us information. And then they potentially are in lawsuits with Disney or the theme parks. And now you're getting into another area that we need to kind of work through and figure out how to get that information without either violating HIPAA or violating, if there is a lawsuit, to make sure that we can still get access to some of this information.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, 2 years ago, your initial reluctance to support enthusiastically the $15 an hour minimum wage increase infuriated progressives, people in the labor movement. We obviously heard from people like John Morgan, who led that effort, who said your position was weak and tepid. In hindsight, was it a mistake to not support the minimum wage more strongly?
I did. I wrote an editorial showing support. So that was, the situation with John was given actually misinformation that he has since behind closed doors apologized for receiving wrong information. He was didn't get the full picture and the full facts of what happened, but we did. I wrote a strong editorial supporting the 15-week, excuse me, the $15. And so we were out there. It was not something that I was on stump speeches for the Biden administration talking about. I was focused on the local races. I was focused on what was happening on the presidential race, but we did show support. My concern has been and always will be that every time that we pass constitutional amendments in the state of Florida, the Republican legislature tries to find every possible way to skirt around it, to try to find those loopholes, whether it's class size or whether it's medical marijuana or whether it is restoration of civil rights. And my concern was, and very validly, because look, Brandis tried to. The first legislative session come in and try to get around the actual implementation of the $15 minimum wage. And my other concern was this, and now unfortunately my point is being proven, which I'm heartbroken that we're here, is that to put it into the Constitution, now we are locked at $15. And so unfortunately during inflation, $15 is not enough. And now we're locked here and we can't even go above and beyond that. And we're locked on this $15 and that's not going to be, that's still not a living wage. And so we've got to be looking at other ways to really help some of these workers on the ground. And so my position was, yes, we need to support this constitutional amendment, but I need to be bringing up other issues like now we've locked ourselves into $15 and the legislature will try to find ways to skirt around it.
Okay. The opinion piece that I think you're describing, I'm seeing it ran on the Fort Myers News Press about a week before the November election in 2020. That would obviously have been after many people had voted. Am I describing the right opinion piece?
Yes, I think it was in a few papers. And definitely we sent it out to the masses. And so I don't know exactly where it ended up being, but I think there was a few that had picked up on it.
Was there, because so much of the agribusiness economy is based on low wage labor, does that explain your initial hesitancy?
No, in fact, most of the big guys in our industry pay over $15. So this wasn't even something that, in fact, I don't recall even having a single conversation with anybody in agriculture about this issue.
One of us goes all the way back to the beginning of Florida electing a lieutenant governor, at which time the candidates were required to present a joint ticket from the very beginning. So if somebody voted for you in the primary, they knew who your lieutenant governor would be. Now it's been changed so that they can kiss and make up after the primary. Question: if you win, would you ask Charlie to be your running mate? And if he wins and asks you, would you accept?
I haven't thought about that. One, because I think I'm winning. But so to run on Charlie's ticket, I don't know if that's even, what I'm going to win. So I'm not concerned about that. I don't know, to be quite honest, because the way I look at this and I look at the ticket, I want to have a ticket and I look at the full ticket from the U.S. Senate seats to the other three cabinet positions to make sure that we are the most diverse and to make sure that every community has somebody that they can look at the executive ticket and say, this person looks like me, talks like me, acts like me, and that they find that there is a common ground with. And so knowing that we potentially, and not to tip my where I'm endorsing anywhere, but we have the possibility to have 4 women that are coming out of these primaries, and 3 of them being women of color. And so looking at that demographic, making sure that my lieutenant governor reflects demographics that may not have been seen with the rest of the executive ticket. So my decisions are going to be based on who comes out of the primary and to make sure that we have a cross-section of diversity on the executive ticket.
Commissioner Fried, the burning of sugar cane by the agriculture industry in Palm Beach County and elsewhere is a major source of concern in those communities around the lake. Many of them poor communities of color. What power does the Department of Agriculture have to phase out or stop cane burning, and why hasn't it been stopped?
First of all, this is one of those things that I came in and worked on tackling. The burn program we got to look at it in the totality of the whole state, because the burning program doesn't just deal with sugar. It deals with everything across the entire state. And the burn program in Florida is actually recognized across the world as one of the best burn programs in the world, because burning is essential for land management. It is part of how you make sure that you don't have more fires. And so it's part of the conservation of agriculture and of the land management. And so, however, when I came in, realizing again that the burn program had not been updated in over 20 years, that when I asked my team to come through and give me new ideas, new proposals of how to move the state forward, they came with like maps, like handwritten maps of where things were, and nothing was digitized, nothing was. And so we did 2 separate phases of our program. The first phase, we came in looking at air quality. And again, all of these have been approved by the EPA, making sure that we are in conjunction with EPA and making sure that we are doing everything by the book. And so we came in and looking at air quality, making sure that we're testing for air quality before we give out a burn permit. We look at the indexing of that area, the wind quality, and to change some of those areas to make sure that we were doing right on that front. Also making sure that anybody who is applying for a burn permit actually has to go through a separate course. Because what was happening is that you had like the company itself that was getting the permit, and they were qualified, but the actual individual who was overseeing the burn was not. And so we came in and changed the way the permitting process was working, making sure the qualifications were changing. We then did a second phase. And this is one that goes to kind of your question, Steve, is the population south of the lake is significantly different today than it was 20 to 30 years ago. And there was inherent discrimination. There was discrimination of where the wind blew. There was discrimination as far as how the permits were given out. So we came in and we changed the zoning of those permits, changing to make sure that, in fact, if the wind quality and the wind was blowing, that it wasn't going in a certain direction, that it was only going up. And so since then, we have seen a significant decrease in the amount of complaints that we've received. But it is also part of our phasing out, that you can't just turn off a switch. That when it comes to a huge regulatory situation like this, you've got to be working on phasing things out. And
Okay.
so that's what we've done on the first 2 rounds. And I've spoken to a lot of the sugarcane growers in the South. And I said, look, my goal is to get you to stop growing sugar. That's why I want you to start growing hemp. Which is going to be more more lucrative for those industries, better for the environment. And in fact, even when it comes to the environment, we just received the Democratic Environmental Caucus endorsement, as well as the past president of the Environmental Caucus. So we are doing a significant amount of work. Does more work need to be done? Always.
Okay. My question is this, Nikki. The tax structure, the modern tax structure of Florida began in 1949 with Fuller Warren and a 3% sales tax. We realize you'd have to work with probably an uncooperative Republican legislature, but what specific reforms and changes are needed to Florida's tax structure?
Well, I think that one of the things that we've seen over and over again is these tax breaks to our big corporations. And you've seen that, that the governor talks about, these big tax relief programs, but it's only helping the big guys in our state. And that needs to be reformed. We need to be closing some of those loopholes, not be giving these tax breaks to the big corporations, and making sure that they are being held accountable for what they're doing in our state, including the unemployment benefits, which is where some of this money is coming from, and to make sure that they are still investing in our unemployment system, making sure that they're doing what's necessary. That's really the biggest, I think, changes to the tax structure that I would see, is closing some of these corporate loopholes, and making sure that we're not giving them an undue advantage and almost, I want to say, monopoly in some of these areas because of these types of tax breaks that doesn't allow competition for maybe new startups or new companies that want to come into the state.
Real quick,
Yeah.
I had a follow up to the cane burning.
Sure.
Commissioner Fried, you mentioned that the cane burning done here in Florida is among the safest and most environmentally friendly programs out there, but I mean, isn't that just because large cane burners in other countries have stopped doing it? I mean, in Brazil, in the major cane burning area in Sao Paulo, they agreed in 2007 to stop doing it. They had stopped by 2017 and only recently started burning again when Jair Bolsonaro started opening up the regulations again. So when you say that cane burning in Florida is such a safe program, aren't there safer ways to do this? And is it really necessary, like you said?
So I didn't say the cane burning, I said the whole state's burning program. So because I have to look at things in totality, because I can't just segment out. I as the regulator, I have to create a program that applies to the entire state. And so when I said that, it is the burn program of Florida. It is well recognized across the entire world. And so we are going through, we have even put in new parameters when the wind is blowing in a different direction to do back burning and doing a lot more back burning. We've also lessened the amount of time for the season, trying to get us into that phased out approach. But it can't just be overnight that this stops. And so that's why we have taken concerted efforts, made these new policy changes when it comes to sugarcane burning that has made significant improvements into the communities, into the air quality, that we are taking these aggressive steps. And then there's, of course, there's a lot more that can be done. But right now we are in a phase out approach, and it just can't happen overnight.
So you're saying that you can't specifically target cane burning. Any program that you put into place has to account for any sort of burn programs, regardless of crop or what have you. Is that right?
Otherwise, we potentially could get sued. You know, if that we are targeting one area over the other when it comes to the program, it potentially opens up us liability, which is why we are trying to do what we can in certain and do what we can, and then start talking to, again, I've had very frank conversations with the big sugar growers in our state, telling them this has to get phased out. We need to start looking and investing in green harvesting. We need to make sure that the industry is ready for green harvesting in the state of Florida, to make sure that we're, again, trying to wean them off of sugar burning, sugar growing to begin with, and start looking at some of those alternative crops. And we've seen some of these guys actually start, I don't remember which one, but at least one of them, if not two of them, have started looking at hemp, and they're doing pilot projects on their land, which again is part of when I passed hemp, which is part of the conversation that I wanted to be having.
The costs of campaigns and how campaigns are run in Florida. It is now standard operating procedure for even a rookie candidate for a Florida House seat to have a political committee, which is a soft money machine that is allowed to take unlimited donations. You yourself, of course, as a statewide candidate, have a political committee called Florida Consumers First. My question is the frustration we have in the news media at tracking money to this fund, because you're getting dark money contributions that from groups like Floridians for Economic Advancement, which I am told is linked to Associated Industries, which is definitely a pro-Republican business group. Why would anyone linked with AIF be giving a Democratic candidate for governor money?
You know, first of all, Steve, we have to have campaign finance reform across the state and across the country. That is a necessity. The fact that, you know, the type of money that gets flown around in our state and our country is ridiculous. And so we've got to have campaign finance reform. That is a necessity. And so look, and I'm a different type of Democrat. You know, I'm somebody who is about small government, free market, home rule, less spending, less taxes. And at the end of the day, you know, those are true conservative principles that used to be from the Republican Party. And so because some of those in the business industry that I have had an opportunity to work with in the last 1.5 years want to show that there was a balance, that they're not just supporting Republican candidates, but Democratic candidates too, that understand economic opportunities. And I would probably assume that that's why that they're showing some support, but also the realization they may be showing me some support, but what is it, like a 5-to-1 ratio between Democrats and Republicans of that money, or vice versa.
Okay, small free markets, less spending, home rule, and support for small business. Give us just one example of something you would spend less money on.
Less money on there. There's lots of pork that is in our budget. Lots of pet projects that are going back to our legislators at home that is spending way too much money. Again, we're having tax relief for so many of our corporations that needs to be reversed. That we are spending a lot of extra money when it even comes to the healthcare system, that because we need Medicaid expansion. And so when we do Medicaid expansion, it's actually going to be a cost saving inside of the state budget.
If you're elected governor, what would you do about the election crime and security unit that Governor DeSantis has just created?
We'd be dismantling it. There was no problems at the polls. We know that the only fraud that happened in the 2020 election came from the Republicans. So I keep saying on the campaign trail that the governor wants an election police. I hope he's putting it at the Republican headquarters, because that's where the fraud came from. But look, we need to do whatever we have to expand voting access. That means everything from access to drop boxes, to have same-day voter registration, to when you have your getting your driver's license, that you are automatically getting your voting cards, making sure that we are protecting our polls, not with law enforcement, because unfortunately, we know who that's going to go out and suppress. That, and somebody in the minority community who doesn't trust law enforcement goes to a voting booth and they see law enforcement there, they may be more inclined to walk away. And so we need to be making sure that we are securing the polls, but doing so in a manner that actually helps voters and not looking at ways to suppress them, which is what this election police does.
I hate to bring this up, but I wanted you to have a chance to address it, because it is a highly unusual circumstance that a candidate for governor has an open ethics commission case with a probable cause finding. As you know, the Ethics Commission has found probable cause to believe that you did not properly disclose approximately $400,000 of lobbying income for 2017 and 2018. And you have amended those filings. You did that in, I believe, 2021.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to get your explanation of how that happened. I know that a lot of Floridians would kind of wonder how $400,000 went by, but just tell us what happened as much as you can, and what's the status of the case.
Absolutely. Well, first off, we made those changes. We found the errors and we made changes, and which is very different than what you have seen we still don't see President Trump's taxes. We've seen plenty of other elected officials that wait until they're caught, when I think that the people of our state want transparency, want to say, look, we made a mistake and we fixed it. But the other thing is that we were not trying to hide anything. As you all know, every single quarter I had to report all of my lobbying money. So it was already out there in public. It was a very simple mistake on my part. This is very clear. What happened was when I first declared for office in 2018, I thought it was a snapshot of what my finances were at that moment, and not recognizing that it was actually the finances from the previous year. And so when we did the reforms the following year afterwards, I was going off of the same notion that it was that snapshot, and not recognizing that it was from the year before. So as soon as we figured out that was what happened, we immediately corrected it. And what was happening in the ethics committee, first off, all of them are appointed by Republican Speaker of the House and Senate President and Governor. And yes, there are Democrats on there, but and what the ethics committee said is just the mere fact of changing the form is an admission that the forms were wrong. And so that is something that I think it needs to be changed in how we're viewing these kinds of cases, because you want to encourage your elected officials and those who have to file reports to actually step up and fix it. And so if you're saying by the mere fact of just changing them and recognizing that there was a mistake, you automatically are admitting that there was a mistake to begin with, and that's why there was probable cause, because yes, we changed them, and that on its face was declared, the issue. But we have been always upfront, we've been transparent, and I would hope that the people of our state know that, no one's perfect, but we owned up to what happened, because it was an honest mistake and not something that I was trying to hide by any stretch of the imagination. Because again, all of my lobbying reports are public, all the information is out there already. Wasn't trying to hide the ball.
If you're not successful on August 23rd, will you fully and unconditionally support Charlie Crist as your nominee?
Listen, Steve, I have been in the trenches for 3.5 years fighting against this guy. He is a threat to democracy. He is a threat to our civil rights. He is a threat to our LGBTQ plus community. He is a threat to everything decent that is America. And I will do everything in my power to make sure that he loses in November at all costs.
Okay. We've been at it here for about 90 minutes, and we haven't covered everything, but we have covered a lot of ground. And I just want to just go around the horn and just ask my colleagues if anybody has another question they want to pose. Okay, so thank you very much for your time today. I do think I would like to give you the opportunity, because certainly we've overlooked some issue that's really important to you. And so I want to give you a couple of minutes to make a concluding statement. Nikki, go ahead.
Absolutely. First of all, again, thank you. Not only thank you for this time today, but thank you for what you all do. And my closing argument is this. We have to beat Ron DeSantis. We have to. For everything that is decent in our country and everything that is decent in our state, he's got to go. And so knowing that, we as Democrats know that the only shot that we have to beating Ron is my candidacy. Charlie will lose in epic proportion. It didn't work in 2014 when Rick Scott was underwater. Everybody, people's theory at the time that because he was a Republican, because he was an independent, that he was going to get those votes and the crossover. That did not happen. Republicans do not like Charlie. Independents do not trust Charlie. And to get us across the finish line in November, to give us even that chance to get there, we need the energy. We need the excitement. We need somebody who is going to be able to not only energize the base, but get to our independents, get the crossover from Republicans. I did it in 2018. I mean, you all were covering my reelection, my recount. You saw how many ballots were Scott, DeSantis, Fried. That is a powerful, that's what happened in 2018. And that energy that I bring and that movement that I get when I win this primary, that excites not only the state of Florida, that brings new life to that Democrats are in play across the entire country. And that energy that we are going to get not only catapults us across the state, but across the nation. That the cavalry is going to come here to the state of Florida. That the cavalry is going to come here to make sure that we are beating Ron DeSantis. And the second that we get out of the primary and the polls start to close, because it's still Florida, polls are going to close, and they're going to close in tight. That the second that blood is starting to be smelled from across the nation, the Republicans are going to come in and want to take down Ron DeSantis. He has stepped on a lot of people, and I've spoken to a whole lot of them along the way, that are going to come in and say, well, wait a second, he's not invincible. He is beatable. And are going to come and start flinging shots at him, including those who want to run in 2024, whether it's Rick Scott, whether it is Chris Christie, whether it is Nikki Haley, whether it is Donald Trump. They are going to see that their best shot in 2024 is taking out Ron. And they know that I am the only candidate who is going to be able to draw blood. And Democrats are looking for a fighter. They're looking for somebody who is not only a fighter, but somebody who has won statewide as a Democrat in recent history. The energy, the momentum is here. We are, that the wind is on our backs. And we know that when we win this primary, that is going to be our best shot, not just here in the state of Florida, but across the country, protecting democracy. I am not doing this because I want my name in lights. I can go back to practicing law. I can go back to doing anything else. I am doing this because I truly, fundamentally believe in my heart that I have been trained my entire life for this moment. From the things that I have done my entire career, my entire life, from going on the March to Living back when I was in high school, seeing the concentration camps, fighting for justice, fighting against anti-Semitism and racism my whole life, that this moment in our country, when democracy is slipping through our hands every single moment and every single day, that our only shot of saving our country is taking out Ron DeSantis. And the only shot that Democrats have at doing that is by putting me in that governor spot.
Okay.